When my neighbor leased the fish pond, he completely cut off our water supply. I told him, "Hey, raise the floodgate a bit, will you? You've got to leave some running water for our orchard. It'll make things easier for both of us down the line." Running water? My ass. This is my dam. I'll block it however I damn well please. If your fruit trees dry up and die, what the hell do I care? So, right when he dropped a fortune on premium fish fry for his pond, I went straight to my own land, right upwind of his place, and dug a massive eco-friendly fermentation manure pit. I stirred that crap up every single day. Hey, what the hell are you doing? It reeks. How am I supposed to raise my premium fish in this? I replied, "This is my land. I'm making organic compost. What the hell do you care?" It all started a month ago. Right around noon that day, the roar of an excavator jolted me awake in the orchard. Li Jinbao was out there ordering the workers around, pushing the dam another 10 meters downstream. It stopped right smack against the edge of our orchard. I stormed over. "Li Jinbao, that water is the only lifeline for my orchard. If you build the dam here, how are my trees supposed to survive?" Li Jinbao gave me a sideways glare. "Let him dry up and die. Aren't you an agricultural college grad? Didn't the books teach you how to make it rain?" Just then, my dad came running out from the orchard and pointed straight at Li Dekai. "Li Dekai, we agreed to take turns using the water. Now you're sucking the groundwater dry too? Are you trying to kill us off?" Li Dekai just bit down on his cigarette and sneered. "Oh, calm down, old Lin. Don't be so dramatic. We built this dam. I'll block the water however I want." My dad's face turned beet red. "This land clearly belongs to us." Li Jinbao marched right up and started poking my dad hard in the chest. "Shut up, you old fart. And don't you dare touch this dam. The water is on my side now, which makes it mine. What are you gonna do about it, huh? Go call the cops. Even if the cops show up, all they'll do is mediate." My dad was shaking with absolute rage. "Just leave us a way to survive. I'll fight you to the death." Li Jinbao jumped back and planted his hands on his hips. "Fight? With what? What can that useless son of yours even do besides farm? Come on, hit me. Just try and lay a finger on me. My farm opens in a few days, and I could use some extra cash. If you touch me, I'll sue you so hard you'll be forced to sell the whole damn orchard." I noticed a huge wet patch on Li Jinbao's pants. He was clearly all bark and no bite. I grabbed my dad before he could lunge at him. "Dad, don't dirty your hands. It's a lawful society now." Li Jinbao smirked triumphantly. "I knew you were a spineless coward. Reading all those books made you stupid, huh?" I stared at the two of them, already calculating my next move. "Go ahead, build your dam. Block the water all you want. After all, when too much water builds up, it turns into a disaster." I pulled my dad away and headed home. Li Jinbao's mocking laughter echoed behind us. Once we got inside the house, I fired up my computer and pulled up the County Weather Bureau's wind data and topographic maps. Nobody understood the geography between our land and the Li families better than I did. 3 days later, truckload after truckload of livestock manure was dumped onto our private plot, right in the upwind sweet spot of the Li family's fish pond. My dad watched me working and asked worriedly, "Feng, is this really gonna work?" I looked up, staring at the Li family's newly built luxury fish pond just down the road, a cold smirk creeping across my face. "Dad, the real payback is just getting started." On day one of the compost plant running, the stench rode the wind and blew straight into the Li family's pond. And this was just the appetizer I cooked up for Li Jinbao. By day 3 of the plant's operation, the stink had hit the perfect, toxic sweet spot. Every single day, I'd turn the manure piles right on schedule, letting the ammonia and hydrogen sulfide from the fermentation process release right at 10 a.m. That was exactly when the winds were at their strongest. Li Jinbao finally snapped, around noon that day. He stormed right into our yard, screaming, "Lin Yifeng, you're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" Li Jinbao pointed his finger right in my face. "This damn stench is polluting my whole pond. Shut this down, right now." I was busy logging the compost temperature, and didn't even bother looking up. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Boss Li. I'm just making organic compost on my own property. How is that any of your business? Don't play dumb with me." Li Jinbao lunged forward to grab my collar, but my dad stepped in front of him. "You're just getting back at us for cutting off your water. Let me tell you right now, you are tearing this compost plant down." I slowly put down the thermometer. "Boss Li, let's be reasonable here. This is the official organic composting project. Approval form that I filed with the County Environmental Bureau. Permit number BF 2024-0137. Complete with the red stamp from the Agricultural Department. Li Jinbao froze for a second. I just kept going. My family has 20 acres of orchards, severely lacking organic fertilizer, and the soil has gotten completely compacted. I'm paying out of my own pocket to improve the soil and develop eco-friendly farming. I'm just answering the government's call for green agriculture. You got a problem with that? Go file a complaint with the town. Li Jinbao snatched the papers out of my hand, realizing they were totally legit. His face turned pale with rage. One of his workers whispered from behind him, "Bao, man. This stuff is actually completely legal. My cousin did the exact same thing last year. And the government even gave him a subsidy for it." Li Jinbao slammed the papers onto the dirt. Legal? So what if it's legal? Does that give you the right to suffocate people? Those are high-end koi in there. A single tiny fry costs me $300. I crouched down, picked up my paperwork, and dusted it off. And, am I hurting your precious fish by improving my soil? Do you have any proof? Besides, your pond is at least 50 meters away from my compost setup, and there's a whole line of trees in between. How on earth am I polluting you? Li Jinbao was completely speechless. I stood back up and glared right at him. Boss Li. You sure didn't care if my fruit trees lived or died back then. Now I'm running a perfectly legal operation here. And here you are throwing a fit. You want to take this to the village committee and let them judge? Li Jinbao knew he didn't stand a chance with the village committee. He gritted his teeth and snarled. Fine, you just wait, you little punk. He and his guys stormed off with their tails between their legs. The very next day, more than a dozen industrial fans were set up around the Li family's pond, along with boxes and boxes of heavy-duty deodorizers. They were frantically spraying liquid into the air. My dad asked worriedly, "Feng, can they really cover up the stench like that?" I just looked at those spinning fans. Don't worry, Dad, they bought the absolute cheapest chemical deodorizers. Once that mixes with the organic matter in my compost, it's only gonna smell a whole lot worse. And sure enough, by the afternoon, the stench coming from the Li family's fish pond didn't fade at all, it got stronger. It even carried this sharp, stinging chemical smell now. Later, I got a call from the village head. He said Li Dekai was throwing a massive fit at the village office, demanding they forcefully tear down my compost facility. I calmly gathered all my legal paperwork, and got ready to head over there. But right before I walked out the door, I made sure to add a little something extra to the compost pile. It was a highly specialized microbial formula I brought back from the Agricultural University's lab. Once this stuff reacted with the cheap spray the Li family was using, over the next few days, Li Jinbao was about to find out what a real bioweapon smells like. I walked in and took my seat in the village meeting room. I laid out my 3 prepared documents right in front of me. Li Dekai had already been stewing in there for half an hour. The second he saw me walk in, he slammed his hand on the table and started whining to the village head. He claimed the foul stench from my compost yard caused his 200,000 yuan investment in koi fry to suffer massive stress reactions, crying that over 300 of them had already died. He screamed about a direct financial loss of over 100,000 yuan. Old Zhang, the village head, just looked at me, signaling for me to explain myself. I didn't panic at all. I slowly opened my first document. It was my official organic fertilizer project permit, legally issued by the County Agricultural Bureau. All the paperwork was spotless, and it fully met every single environmental standard. I pointed out that my compost site was exactly 52 meters away from the Li family's pond, perfectly legal for the safety distance rules. Li Dekai started panicking. Just because the distance is legal doesn't mean it's not killing my fish. He yelled. I just nodded, and casually flipped open my second document. This one was a soil test report for my orchard, officially stamped and certified by the county agricultural station. The report clearly showed that my 20 acres of fruit trees, due to severe, long-term water shortages, had its soil organic matter dropped to just 0.3%. That is way below the 1.5% standard needed for the trees to survive. If I didn't improve the soil immediately, my entire orchard was dead for sure. Old Zhang read through the report, and his face instantly got very serious. I took the opening to drop the real bomb. The only reason my orchard is starved for water and nutrients is because the Li family maliciously cut off my entire water supply. I demanded right then and there that they restore my water rights. Otherwise, I have absolutely no choice but to rely on this compost to keep my trees alive. Lee Dekai's face went completely pale. He started stammering, totally at a loss for words. Then, I pulled out my third piece of evidence. It was a formal witness statement regarding a verbal agreement made years ago between my grandfather and the old man of the Lee family. Even though there wasn't a formal written contract for it, the witness testimonies absolutely proved that they had a deal to take turns using the water. Old Jong flipped through the statements and asked Lee Dekai if it was true. Lee Dekai stubbornly crossed his arms and barked, "Verbal agreements don't mean squat. My family paid good money to build that dam. Why the hell should anyone else get to use it?" I just laughed. I looked right at him and fired back, "All right, since you claim the dam is entirely yours. Well, the air over my property belongs to me. Who are you to tell me I can't make compost in my own air?" That completely shut him up. He was choking on his own rage. Old Jong thought about it for a moment, then made his ruling. He stated firmly, his compost project is completely legal. The village committee has no right to interfere. As for the water dispute, I strongly suggest you two sit down and work it out between yourselves. The village committee can help mediate the talks, but we cannot force a decision. Lee Dekai's face turned completely green with pure anger. He threw his hands up in a huff and stormed right out of the room. After the meeting, I made a special trip to the Lee family's fish pond. Even from a distance, I could see tons of dead young fish floating belly up on the water. Lee Jinbao was directing his workers to scoop out the dead fish, looking absolutely furious. His cheap deodorizers had reacted with the microbial blend in my compost. The resulting chemical stench was far more pungent than just plain manure. But the fatal part? That smell directly irritates the fish's olfactory system, causing their stress response to skyrocket. Over the next 3 days, the Lee family frantically bought up all sorts of deodorizing equipment. Watching from afar, I saw them install 20 high-power air purifiers, and they even hired a professional odor control company from the city, running imported misting gear around the clock. Just the equipment and chemicals alone must have conservatively cost him over 50,000, but the results were practically zero. Because every single day, I precisely adjusted my compost turning schedule based on the wind and temperature, ensuring that stench drifted over to their fish pond at the absolute perfect moment. Lee Jinbao's high-end eco-farm was supposed to open in half a month. Now, he was pulling his hair out just dealing with the smell. Standing in my orchard, watching the Lee family scrambling in the distance, I smirked. The compost yard was just an appetizer. The real show was yet to come. As for those diversion pipes I buried deep under the compost yard, the Lee family still had absolutely no idea. The Lee family's war on the stench dragged on for a week, but things only got worse. I stayed busy at the compost yard every day. On the surface, I was just turning manure. But in reality, I was calculating the exact dose of my microbial blend. I actually developed this formula in my mentor's lab at the Agricultural University. It's designed specifically to speed up organic breakdown, but it has a very special quirk. When it meets chlorine-based chemical deodorizers, it triggers a secondary fermentation, releasing even more complex scent molecules. And those cheap deodorizers the Lee family bought? Their main ingredient just happened to be sodium hypochlorite. By day 8, the stench reached a whole new level. It wasn't just plain manure anymore, but a toxic, chemical-laced, eye-watering stench. Within a 200-meter radius of the Lee family's pond, even the flies took a detour. I noticed the water quality in their pond was starting to change. A fine layer of foam appeared on the surface, a direct result of the fish hyperventilating. Koi fish are incredibly sensitive to their environment. This constant state of stress was causing their immune systems to crash rapidly. Lee Jinbao's dead fish count spiked from a few dozen a day to hundreds. Based on what he paid for those premium fish, he was losing over 30,000 a day. On the morning of the 10th day, a black Audi pulled up to the entrance of the Lee family farm. Watching closely from my orchard, I recognized the man stepping out. Boss Joe, the chairman of the largest local restaurant group. Word was, Lee Jinbao blew over 100,000 on gifts just to land this investor, promising Boss Joe a 30% stake in the farm. Lee Jinbao was escorting him on a tour, walking from the parking lot straight toward the fish pond. Right at that exact moment, deliberately turned the freshest batch of manure. At 10:15 a.m., the southeast wind picked up right on time. A thick, overpowering stench, like an invisible wall, slammed directly into the Lee family farm. I saw Boss Joe's footsteps instantly falter. Before he quickly clamped a hand over his mouth and nose, Lee Jinbao was scrambling to explain, flailing his arms and pointing at his deodorizing machines. They lasted less than 5 minutes by the pond, before Boss Joe suddenly doubled over, grabbed the railing, and started dry heaving. Lee Jinbao scrambled to hand him some water, his face as pale as a dead fish. I put down my shovel, and lit a cigarette. For a farm project like this, what investors care about most is the environment and the experience. An eco-farm that reeks to high heaven? Who would ever want to spend money there? Boss Joe threw up twice by the fish pond. By the end, he couldn't even stand straight. Lee Jinbao had to support him as they walked back, apologizing non-stop the whole way. But Boss Joe's face was livid. He didn't say a single word. After the Audi drove off, Lee Jinbao stood alone at the entrance of the farm, staring blankly at the fish pond for a solid 30 minutes. That afternoon, Lee Dekai brought his guys to my house again. This time, he didn't scream or shout. Instead, he lowered his voice and asked me how much money it would take for me to stop composting. I was pruning the fruit trees. And without even looking up, I replied, "Uncle Lee, I don't need money. I need water. Give me back my water source, and I'll stop immediately." Lee Dekai stayed silent for a long time. Finally, he dropped one sentence and turned to leave. He told me I was dreaming. He'd rather let his fish pond lose money than give me a single drop of water. I watched his back and smiled. Stubbornness comes with a heavy price. And he was about to find out just how crushing that price would be. That very night, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Boss Joe's assistant, asking for the exact location and business details of my orchard. On the phone, they revealed that Boss Joe was very interested in my organic farming project and wanted to find a time to discuss a partnership. I hung up the phone and looked toward the Lee family's farm. The lights over there were glaringly bright. Lee Jinbao was probably staying up all night, desperately trying to salvage the investor situation. But little did he know, the real disaster hadn't even started yet. Those diversion pipes I buried underground would be the final straw that crushed him. By the 12th day, the news of Boss Joe pulling his funding had spread. Lee Jinbao's eco-farm investment plan was completely ruined. 1.2 million in initial investment had gone down the drain. But Lee Dekai gritted his teeth and refused to admit defeat. He decided to double down with his own money and force the farm to open anyway. The very first thing they did was reinforce the dam. 3 excavators started working at the exact same time. They poured concrete at the base of the dam and raised the wall by 1.2 meters. Lee Dekai's plan was clear. Since the investor bailed, he would just expand the fish pond, raise more fish, and make more money. To cover his losses with profits, the reinforced dam was like a wall of iron. It completely blocked off all the water flowing to my orchard. The groundwater level dropped right before my eyes. The leaves on my 20 acres of fruit trees started turning yellow and curling up. My dad looked at the dying trees, pacing around in an absolute panic. He said, "If this keeps up, all the trees will die, and our whole family will be left to starve." I calmed him down and told him not to panic. Then, I started digging massive trenches in the orchard. On the surface, it looked like I was searching for underground water, trying to save the trees by digging irrigation canals. Every day, before the sun even came up, I was out in the fields with my hoe. I'd dig for the entire day. The piles of dirt got higher and higher, and the trenches got deeper and deeper. When Lee Jinbao drove by, he saw me covered in mud, leaned out his car window, and laughed out loud. He sneered, 4 years of college, and you're still just a dirt poor peasant. Digging a trench this deep and still not finding any water. What a complete waste of energy. I just kept digging. What Lee Jinbao didn't know was, I wasn't digging a normal irrigation ditch at all. On the surface, these trenches looked like a total mess, but in reality, they were based on a precise fluid dynamics model. It was a custom-designed vertical diversion system. The depth, the angle, and the slope of every single trench had been calculated over and over. The goal was simple. When the heavy rain finally hits, it would channel the surface runoff underground as fast as possible, creating massive vertical water pressure. And the endpoints of all these diversion channels? They pointed directly to the base of the Lee family's dam. My major back at the agricultural university was agricultural water engineering. My mentor even led a team to study the flood discharge system of the Three Gorges Dam. I spent 2 whole years working on water pressure model calculations, so that makeshift, reinforced dirt dam of Lee Decai's was nothing but a textbook shoddy engineering job in my eyes. They only reinforced the surface, but totally ignored the most critical issue, the supporting strength of the soil at the base. The higher the dam, the more water it holds, and the greater the horizontal thrust pressing against the bottom, and these diversion trenches I dug would instantly raise the groundwater level during a storm, creating reverse pressure from the bottom up. Once those two forces squeezed together, the soil at the dam's base would completely lose its cohesion and undergo liquefaction. When that happens, even the toughest concrete wouldn't hold. I spent 10 whole days digging out a diversion network that covered 3 acres of land. At every single junction, I buried a layer of gravel to speed up water infiltration. Every main channel was aimed straight at the dam's weak spots. Whenever Li Jinbao passed by, he would throw a few insults my way. He would say I was losing my mind over money, digging a pathetic ditch with so much dedication. Told me I was better off just giving up and selling my land. I just stood up straight and watched him drive off in his brand new Land Rover. It seemed he was fully confident about his farm's grand opening. By the evening of the 15th day, I finally finished digging the very last diversion channel. This trench was 1.8 meters deep, reaching right to a spot just 3 meters away from the base of the dam. At the bottom of the trench, I laid down a layer of special water-absorbing resin. This stuff expands 10 times its size when it hits water, which can generate a massive amount of volumetric pressure in a fraction of a second. My dad asked me if these ditches would really help us find water. I didn't answer him, I just looked up at the sky. The weather forecast showed that in half a month, there would be a massive, widespread rainstorm lasting for over 36 hours. That would be the doomsday for the Lee family's farm, and the day my orchard is reborn. Now, all the traps had been set. The only thing left to do was to wait for Li Jinbao to walk right into the deadly trap I had designed for him. And even now, he still thought I was just some pathetic loser who had lost his mind digging ditches. On the 3rd day after the diversion channels were finished, the Lee family began a frantic expansion. 6 excavators worked around the clock, forcefully expanding the fish pond from its original 8 acres all the way up to 15 acres. Lee Decai's plan was wildly aggressive. He wanted to finish the entire project in just 2 weeks, rushing to open for business before the local temple fair. To hold back that much more water, the dam was raised even higher. This time, they poured 1.5 meters of solid concrete, and even layered an impermeable membrane on the water-facing side. From the outside, it actually looked pretty legitimate, but when I stood in my orchard and measured it with a rangefinder, I realized the dam's height had already exceeded 4.2 meters. The water capacity was at least 80,000 cubic meters, on a conservative estimate. That level of water pressure was already pushing the absolute limit of what a dirt dam could hold. But what was even more fatal was that to save money, the Lee family had not reinforced the foundation at all. All that concrete was just poured straight over the original layer of dirt. It was like building a house on quicksand. The condition of our family's fruit trees was getting worse by the day. The ongoing drought caused massive leaf drop, and some of the branches had already dried up completely. My dad would just stare at the trees and cry every day. He kept saying this was the legacy Grandpa left us, and we couldn't let it die in our hands. But I didn't panic. I formulated a special foliar fertilizer back at the Ag University lab. The main ingredients were an alginic acid and amino acid complex, which could help the trees survive under extreme drought conditions. It maintains their basic survival functions. Every morning and evening, I would take a sprayer and carefully coat every single tree. This type of fertilizer enters the leaf tissue directly through the pores, completely bypassing the need for the roots to absorb water. Even though it wouldn't bring the trees back to full health, it at least kept them alive. As long as we could just hold out until the heavy rains came, the orchard would bounce right back. On the 20th day, armed with my camera and all the measurement data, I made a trip to the County Water Bureau. Section Chief Zhang from the Water Department received me. I handed him a detailed report. It included the exact height and water capacity of the Lee family's dam, the state of its foundation, and all the glaring safety hazards. I specifically pointed out that, according to the dam safety regulations, any dam over 4 meters high has to undergo a professional safety assessment and get a construction permit from the Water Department. Chief Zhang flipped through my paperwork, and his face grew more and more serious. He immediately arranged for 2 engineers to go to the Lee family's estate for a site inspection the very next day. The experts spent the entire morning measuring the dam. They used ground-penetrating radar to check the foundation, and a leveling instrument to measure the dam's structural settlement. The final conclusion made Lee Dakai go pale. The dam was a massive safety hazard. They had to release the water immediately to lower the level and completely reinforce the foundation. Lee Dakai started arguing with the experts right then and there. He yelled that he spent over 300,000 on this dam, and they were about to open for business. There was no way he was draining it. The head of the expert team warned him that if he didn't fix it, the Water Bureau had the authority to force him to. That very afternoon, Lee Dakai drove off to the county town. 3 days later, the Water Bureau suddenly changed their tune. Chief Zhang called me to say that upon further review, although the Lee family's dam had a few minor issues, it wouldn't affect normal use, and it had officially passed inspection. I could hear the helplessness in his voice. Obviously, Lee Dakai had pulled some strings and bribed the right people. For a nouveau riche guy from a small town, buying off a few local officials was a piece of cake. I hung up the phone, actually feeling a wave of relief. What Lee Dakai just did gave me exactly the evidence I needed. The Bureau's official inspection records and the expert's original warning report were all on file. The second that dam gave way, those documents would be hard proof of his gross negligence. When that happened, not only would he be hit with massive civil lawsuits, but he'd also be facing criminal charges. I took pictures of all the documents to back them up, and saved them on an encrypted hard drive along with the audio recordings. Over the next week, the construction of the Lee estate entered its final stages. Their luxury restaurant, cozy cabins, and viewing platforms were finishing up one by one. Lee Jinbao even had 50,000 expensive koi fish flown in from the south, completely packing the fish pond, all those fish splashing around on the surface. It really was quite the spectacle. And with that, Lee Dakai started handing out grand opening invitations all over the village. He bragged that on the farm's grand opening, they'd throw a massive banquet and invite the whole village. Every word was dripping with arrogance, bragging that the Lee family had finally made it, and that they were going to become the most famous entrepreneurs in the whole county. But, right when I got the invitation, the Weather Bureau had just issued a new forecast. A massive storm front was forming down south. It was expected to hit our area in exactly 7 days. The rainfall warning was set for heavy to torrential rain, lasting for 48 hours straight, and the Lee family's grand opening was scheduled in exactly 6 days. Late at night, 5 days before the opening, the infrared cameras I had set up out in the orchard caught something strange. 3 shadowy figures climbed over the orchard fence, heading straight for the drainage ditches I had dug out. On the security monitors, I could see their movements were way too professional. They were carrying shovels and heavy sandbags. Clearly, they came prepared. I just sat there in front of my computer and didn't even step outside to stop them. Instead, I quietly watched the screen. I knew the guy leading them. It was old Zhao, Lee Jinbao's foreman. He was directing the other 2 as they started shoveling dirt straight into my drainage ditches. The 3 of them were working like crazy. Within just 1 hour, they had completely filled in the 2 main channels closest to the orchard. But, what they didn't know was that those 2 channels were just minor branches of the whole drainage system. The real, critical main channel was hidden much deeper, right under the roots of the fruit trees. I had totally covered the entrance with tarps and weeds to keep it perfectly hidden. By 2 a.m., just as they finished packing the dirt and were about to leave, old Zhao suddenly noticed something. He spotted the diagonal channel right near the dam. That trench was dug the deepest, and was the most obvious. Old Zhao hesitated for a second, but finally led his guys over to it. My eyes were glued to the screen, and my heart started racing. That diagonal trench was exactly the bait I had deliberately left out. On the surface, it looked like just another drainage ditch, but in reality, it was the critical spillway for the Lee family's dam. When the Water Bureau experts first inspected it, they made it very clear that the dam had to keep at least 3 emergency spillways open. And this natural slopes drainage path was one of them. Old Zhao and his crew started dumping construction waste right into the trench. Broken bricks, chunks of concrete, scrap rebar, cart after cart, they dumped it all in. They were being so thorough, stomping down every single layer to make absolutely sure the channel was completely blocked dead. The security cameras caught the whole thing in crystal clear detail. The timestamps, their faces, every tiny detail of their sabotage was perfectly recorded. By 4:30 in the morning, the three of them finally called it a night. They patted the surface flat with their shovels, and even tossed some dead grass over it to blend it in. Old Zhao pulled out his phone and made a call. Even though I couldn't hear a word, his big thumbs up told me everything. Li Jinbao was clearly thrilled with the job. After they left, I didn't rush out to fix the ditches. Instead, I threw on my dark clothes, grabbed my toolbox, and quietly slipped down to the base of the dam. That spillway old Zhao had just blocked up was meant to relieve the water pressure at the bottom during a storm, keeping the dam's foundation from eroding and collapsing. Now that the channel was completely choked off, all that intense water pressure was going to slam directly into the middle of the dam. And that was exactly the weakest point of the foundation, the spot where Ji Dekai had cut corners to save a quick buck. I took my rock hammer and gave the downstream side of the dam a few light taps, listening to the echo to check how solid it was inside. Sure enough, the sound coming from the middle section was completely hollow. It meant the dirt packed inside was full of huge air pockets. My next move had to be extremely careful. Down there at the bottom of the dam, 3 meters away from the blocked spillway, I used a long, thin steel rod to drill about a dozen vertical holes. Each hole was about 80 centimeters deep. The purpose of these holes was to speed up the saturation of the bottom soil layer during a heavy rainstorm, making the dam's foundation lose its load-bearing capacity much faster. After drilling them, I poured a little bit of expanding clay slurry into each one. This stuff expands when it hits water and forms a slick lubricating layer, which can drop the soil's shear strength by more than 40%. Plus, it's completely colorless and odorless, so even if someone noticed it, they'd just think it was normal water seepage. I finished everything right before dawn. I went back inside and burned the security footage onto 3 separate discs. I hid them in 3 different locations. This evidence proves that the Li family deliberately ruined the dam's safety features. The spillway system has absolutely nothing to do with me. The next morning, my dad saw that someone had filled in the diversion channel. He was furious and wanted to go confront the Li family, but I stopped him and said to just let it go. It was going to rain soon anyway. Those channels had already served their purpose. My dad didn't understand what I meant, and just let out a heavy sigh. I stood by the window, staring at the Li family's towering dam. Now, its internal structure was fundamentally destroyed. It was basically a ticking time bomb, just waiting for the heavy rain to set it off. The latest weather forecast showed that severe storms would hit the night after next. Meanwhile, the grand opening banquet for the Li family's farm was set for tomorrow at noon. The timing was so perfect, it was breathtaking. The morning before the grand opening, I gathered all the documents together, put them in a waterproof folder, and headed over to the Li family farm. There were 3 reports in that folder. The first was an assessment I commissioned from the Provincial Geological Survey. Evaluating the soil stability, the report clearly stated that the soil where the Li family's dam was built was in a high-risk zone for liquefaction, making it completely unsuitable for large water storage facilities. The second report was my own prediction of the flood peak flow, based on weather data and the size of the watershed. The conclusion was that under continuous heavy rain, the current structure of the dam wouldn't be able to handle the sheer water pressure. The third was a copy of the initial survey records from the Water Bureau's experts. It clearly showed their original conclusion, that the dam was a massive safety hazard. Those 3 reports cost me over 20,000 yuan, but it was worth every single penny. They were going to be my absolute get-out-of-jail-free card when the law came knocking. The Li family farm was all dressed up for the opening. Big red lanterns were hung up all over the courtyard. Workers were setting up the sound system, and the rich smell of food drifted out from the kitchen. Li Dakai was standing by the fish pond, beaming with pride as he greeted the village officials who came to visit. I walked right up to him and shoved the folder right into his hands. He glanced down at the folder, sneered at me, and asked what the hell I was doing there. I didn't waste any time. Right there, in front of 7 or 8 village officials, I pulled out the geological report and shoved every single page right in his face. The numbers in the report were horrifying. The load-bearing capacity of the soil beneath the dam was only 120 kilopascals per square meter. And right now, with 80,000 cubic meters of water, the pressure had already hit 150 kilopascals. That's a 25% overload. A total structural collapse could happen at any second. I made sure to point out that the weather station predicted heavy rain the day after tomorrow. Flash floods would make the water levels surge, and when that happened, the dam would be under more than twice the pressure it was right now. The consequences would be absolutely disastrous. Lee Dekai listened, but his expression didn't change one bit. He took the report and took a hard look at the Survey Institute's official stamp on the cover. Then, right in front of everyone, he suddenly ripped the report to shreds. The pieces of paper fluttered through the air, scattering all over the ground. Lee Dekai pointed right at my face and snapped, telling me not to think he didn't know what game I was playing. He claimed I just wanted to use this garbage report to scare him into opening the gates for our family's orchard. He said their family's dam cost over $500,000 to build, and it had passed the Water Bureau's inspection. He bragged that they knew way more than an agriculture student like me. The village officials around us just looked at each other in awkward silence. No one dared to say a word. Just then, Li Jinbao walked over too. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of me, running his mouth about posting them in the village WeChat group. To let everyone see what a bitter sore loser looked like. He said I was just jealous that their farm was opening, and that I was purposely making things up to ruin their big day. I didn't argue back. I just quietly opened the camera app on my phone and hit record. I calmly told him that I would keep a copy of this report, and if anything happened to the dam, this footage would prove I had done my legal duty to warn them. If Lee Dekai insisted on ignoring me, consequences would be entirely on his shoulders. Lee Dekai spat on the ground. He called me a total jinx, saying all that studying had turned my brain to mush, and that my head was just full of doom and gloom. He told me to get the hell out of there, to stop being an eyesore, and that I definitely wasn't welcome at their opening banquet tomorrow. I put my phone away, squatted down, and picked up a few torn pieces from the key pages. Those scraps of paper had Lee Dekai's fingerprints all over them, along with the tear marks from the report. This was all solid evidence. Right before I left, I took one last look at the koi thrashing around in the fish pond. 50,000 fish packed tightly together, completely covering the surface of the water. Just to make it look spectacular, Li Jinbao had stocked them at a density way beyond any safe farming standard. Farming at that extreme density was a ticking time bomb in itself. The second the water quality dropped, the death rate of those fish would multiply exponentially. As soon as I got home, I took the video and uploaded it to 3 different cloud servers. Both the video and the audio were crystal clear. It perfectly captured my entire warning, and every single second of Lee Dekai ripping that report to shreds. I even slapped a timestamp and a GPS watermark on the footage, just to make absolutely sure it would hold up legally. My dad asked me what the Lee family had to say. I told him they wouldn't listen, so now we just had to wait and see what happened. At 10 p.m., the Weather Bureau issued an orange alert for severe rainstorms. The rain was coming earlier than expected, hitting by tomorrow night, with an estimated rainfall of 150 millimeters. And some localized areas could see over 200 millimeters. That kind of volume was officially classed as an extreme torrential downpour. I stood by my window, staring at the Lee family's farm lit up like a Christmas tree. They were busy making their final preparations for tomorrow's grand opening, completely clueless. Clueless that a catastrophic disaster was already counting down. Meanwhile, the chain of evidence I had put together was now perfectly sealed. No matter what happened next, the Lee family would have to reap exactly what they sowed. When opening day arrived, the Lee family's farm was buzzing by 6 a.m. 30 banquet tables were laid out across the entire courtyard. Every single table featured an upscale spread of 8 cold and 8 hot dishes. Lee Dekai had gone out of his way to hire a team of professional chefs all the way from the county town. The ingredients alone had cost him over 30,000. Practically everyone in the village had gotten an invitation, along with a few officials from the town, who had been invited over to show their support. My dad and I were the very last ones to show up. A giant inflatable arch stood at the entrance of the farm, reading, Lee Family Eco Farm. Grand opening, in massive gold letters. The blast of celebratory cannons echoed one after another. The speakers blasted deafening festive music. Over by the fish pond, they had set up a viewing deck. Tourists could stand up there and feed the koi. A single bag of fish food went for $10. Lee Jinbao was standing at the entrance greeting guests in a brand new suit. When he saw me and my dad, his smile clearly froze for a second, but he still put on a welcoming act. With so many people watching, he had to keep up appearances, after all. The banquet officially kicked off at 11 a.m. Lee Dekai went from table to table, raising his glass for a toast. His face was glowing red, bragging to anyone who would listen about how the ancestors had blessed the Lee family. How they had finally struck it rich and built a massive business. He even wiped a fake tear from his eye when he got all emotional. The crowd broke into applause. I just sat quietly in a corner seat, silently observing everything around me. The fish pond's water level had risen another 20 centimeters since yesterday. To make it look impressive for the grand opening, Lee Jinbao had pumped in more water right before dawn. Now, the water was less than 40 centimeters from the top of the dam. 50,000 koi were thrashing around in the pond. It was definitely a spectacular sight, but I noticed something. Some of the fish were already gasping at the surface. That was a clear sign of oxygen depletion. On the water-facing side of the earth dam, a few faint wet streaks were barely visible. That meant seepage. The waterproof layer at the bottom was already starting to fail. Under normal circumstances, this level of leaking wouldn't pose an immediate threat. But if a heavy storm hit, the leaking water would rapidly soften the soil. That would ultimately lead to the entire dam collapsing. Right at 12 p.m., Lee Jinbao swaggered over to my table, raising his glass to make a public speech. His voice was booming, clearly making sure everyone around us could hear him. He announced how rare it was for our village to produce a college grad, but what a damn shame it was if all those books just made you stupid. Then he changed his tune, mocking me for digging compost pits right next to his fancy farm. Claiming I spent my days sniffing garbage while acting like I was on top of the world. Calling me the perfect example of why college was a waste of time. The crowd around us burst into laughter. A few villagers who were close to the Lee family started joining in, jeering at me. Saying an agricultural science degree couldn't even beat a pig farmer. I completely ignored their taunts. I just picked up my teacup and took a slow sip. Seeing that I wasn't fighting back, Lee Jinbao got even more smug. He went on about how today was a glorious day for the Lee family. Saying that if I, the only son of the Lin family, wasn't a total loser, I'd build a real business too. Instead of hiding in the orchard digging ditches all day long, my dad was sitting right next to me. His face completely flushed with anger, ready to stand up and yell back. I pressed a firm hand on his shoulder, silently telling him to stay cool. Right at that moment, I noticed a massive dark storm cloud rolling in from the horizon. The clouds were thick and oppressively low, lined with an ominous, iron-gray edge. It was the classic look of a cumulonimbus cloud. A massive supercell storm was rapidly closing in. I pulled out my phone and opened up the live weather radar. Turns out, the storm system was moving way faster than the original forecast. It would hit us in 4 hours, tops. I slowly set down my teacup. I looked up at Lee Jinbao, who was still running his mouth, and finally spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for the whole table to hear. I said, "Your grand opening today is sure lively, but it might just be the closing ceremony for your precious farm, too." Lee Jinbao froze for a second. Then, he burst into a mocking roar of laughter. He asked me if I was out of my mind with jealousy and just talking nonsense. I didn't bother explaining. I just slowly raised my hand, pointing toward the dark, rolling clouds gathering on the horizon, and told him if he didn't believe me, we'd see the truth in 4 hours. The people around us followed my gaze, watching the clouds gather at a visible speed as the sky grew noticeably darker. The faces of a few older villagers suddenly dropped. Having farmed all their lives, they were highly sensitive to the weather and instantly recognized the warning signs of a massive storm. Lee Jinbao tried to say something else, but a sudden, fierce gust of wind ripped through the area. Colorful flags on the viewing deck snapped wildly, and a bunch of decorative balloons were instantly blown away. Dense ripples spread rapidly across the fish pond, sending the startled koi scattering in a panic. The low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. I glanced at the heavy rain warning on my phone, which showed that the downpour would start right at 3 o'clock. As for the Lee family's horribly riddled dam, whether it could survive this storm was entirely up to fate now. The banquet dragged on, but the atmosphere had already shifted into an uneasy tension. At exactly 2:45 in the afternoon, the first heavy drop of rain hit the fish pond. The guests started packing up to leave. Lee Jinbao quickly ordered his workers to move the outdoor tables and chairs inside, stubbornly insisting it was just a passing shower. That wouldn't ruin their afternoon fishing plans. My dad and I weren't in a rush to leave, though. Instead, we just stood at the farm entrance, watching the sky go completely pitch black. Right at 3 o'clock, the torrential downpour unleashed. The sheer violence of the rain was way beyond the weather forecast. Massive, heavy raindrops smashed against the ground, kicking up splashes over a foot high. Visibility instantly plummeted to less than 10 meters, swallowing the entire world in a thick curtain of rain. I grabbed my dad's arm and headed back. By now, the floodwater on the road was already over our ankles. The muddy, swirling rainwater quickly formed a raging yellow torrent. I purposely took a detour past the edge of our orchard to check the drainage system I had dug earlier. Sure enough, all the trenches were working perfectly. The surface runoff was flushing down the exact slopes I designed, rapidly surging right into the main channel. Before pouring down the vertical shafts deep into the soil, the floodwaters that would have completely drowned our fruit tree roots were fully drained away in less than 10 minutes. The carefully layered gravel and superabsorbent resin were doing their crucial job right beneath our feet, but even more importantly, these drainage trenches were pushing all that rainwater directly into the groundwater table at an insane speed. A massive vertical water pressure was steadily building up right under the base of the Lee family's dam. It seeped upward through the soil pores, creating a violent, invisible upward thrust. I had done the math. If this brutal storm kept pounding for 2 hours, that upward pressure would hit its absolute peak, and when that happened, the structural integrity of the dam's base would drop straight to its breaking point. Once we got back home, I flipped open my laptop and pulled up the real-time weather tracking. The radar showed that the core of the storm was moving incredibly slowly, meaning it would hover right over us for at least 6 hours. That meant the total rainfall would easily smash past 200 millimeters, reaching the level of a catastrophic 50-year flood. Outside the window, the thunder violently roared, as flashes of lightning shattered the dark sky into pieces. By 4:30, I peered through my binoculars. The water level in the Lee family's fish pond had already surged to just 20 centimeters below the top of the dam. Lee Jinbao and 7 or 8 of his workers were desperately working through the driving rain on the dam. They were trying to open the spillway to release the floodwaters, but the spillway was built way too high. It was completely useless, but the real death sentence was the flash floods from the upper valleys, which were now rapidly converging. The stream that was usually just a trickle had turned into a roaring mudslide. Muddy floodwaters, churning with branches and rocks, were violently surging into the Lee family's reservoir. The water level was rising at 3 centimeters a minute. At that rate, in less than 10 minutes, the water was going to spill right over the dam. I could see Lee Jinbao panicking. He was running back and forth across the dam, screaming something into his walkie-talkie. A few excavators rolled in, trying to dig a makeshift spillway into the side of the dam. But they were too late. At 5:10, I detected an abnormal shift in the groundwater levels. The bentonite clay buried near the base of the dam had absorbed so much water it was pushed to its absolute limit. Massive slick spots had formed between the soil layers, and the structural integrity of the entire foundation was failing fast. On the downstream slope of the dam, water started piping through. Several muddy streams gushed out from the base, gouging out massive, bowl-sized craters in the dirt. It was a clear sign that the internal structure was collapsing. The dam was on the verge of breaking. I noticed the koi in the fish pond were all starting to float to the surface. 50,000 fish were packed together, gasping desperately for air. The torrential rain had turned the water into toxic mud, and the oxygen levels were plummeting. Dead fish were already floating belly up everywhere. The million-plus bucks the Lee family had dumped into this was vanishing before their eyes at a terrifying speed. By 5:30, Lee Jinbao started frantically directing the excavator. He was trying to force the floodwaters straight into my orchard. The excavator's bucket had already crossed the property line, digging a trench right on my land. I threw on my raincoat, grabbed my phone, and charged out into the storm. This time, I was going to make sure everyone saw exactly who was breaking the law and who was digging their own grave. I stood less than 5 meters in front of the excavator. I pointed my phone right at the cab and started a live stream for the whole village. In 30 seconds, we hit over 500 viewers. The footage was blurry through the pouring rain, but it was clear enough for everyone to see what was happening. I adjusted my phone's angle, making sure the camera got a clear shot of that excavator claw tearing ruthlessly into my land. The property marker was right there on the left side of the screen. Hard, undeniable proof. I spoke directly into the camera. Everyone in the village, be my witness. The Lee family is illegally tearing up my land, trying to divert the floodwaters right into my orchard. The live chat instantly exploded. People were asking what was going on, while others were tearing into the Lee family for crossing the line. A few of Lee's relatives tried to defend him, but mostly, the chat was flooded with question marks. Like, why the hell was the water level in that massive fish pond so dangerously high? Lee Jinbao spotted me filming and came charging down the dam. He was soaked to the bone, his eyes bloodshot. He looked completely unhinged as he screamed at me, "Get the hell out of the way, or I'll bury you with it." I didn't step back. Instead, I took 2 steps forward, and delivered the line I'd been holding onto for a long time. "You cross this property line, and you're looking at malicious destruction of private property and illegal flooding. Every bit of the fallout is on you." I said it loud and clear. Everyone on the stream heard every single word, but Lee Jinbao was beyond caring at this point. The leaks battering the dam were getting worse. Over a dozen geysers of water were now violently spraying from the base. The water level in the fish pond kept climbing. It was already starting to spill over the top of the dam. If they didn't drain it immediately, the entire dam was going to collapse at any second. The excavator kept digging. Lee Jinbao shoved me aside. He started yelling at the driver to dig faster. And right at that moment, a car slammed on its brakes in the pouring rain, coming to a screeching halt right at the farm's entrance. Boss Joe charged out of the vehicle, not even bothering to grab an umbrella. He sprinted straight to the edge of the fish pond. The sight before him left him frozen to the spot. The surface of the pond was packed with dead fish, just a dense, sickening sea of white bellies. They were bobbing in the muddy water, giving off a horrific, stomach-churning stench. Those premium koi, worth $300 apiece, were now floating there, dead in massive clusters. At a rough guess, at least 30,000 fish were completely lifeless. Boss Joe's face turned deathly pale. He spun around, furiously demanding Lee Dakai to explain what the hell was going on. Lee Dakai stammered, frantically trying to blame it on the heavy rain, calling it a freak accident, pleading that farming always carries risks, and swearing he'd take full responsibility. Boss Joe wasn't having any of it. Right then and there, he declared he was pulling every single dime of his investment. On top of that, he demanded the Lee family pay back his initial survey costs, along with the guaranteed dividends they'd promised, a grand total of $480,000. Whipping out his phone, he called his lawyer right in front of everyone. Lee Dakai tried to beg, but Boss Joe just turned on his heel and walked away. Right before getting in his car, he snapped, "See you in court." And my live stream caught every single second of it. The viewer count had already smashed past 2,000, with plenty of locals from the town and county watching. The drama was blowing up fast. Then, at exactly 6 o'clock, the tipping point arrived. A deep, guttural rumble echoed from the bottom of the dam. It was the sickening sound of the internal earth structure completely giving way. The breaking point I had calculated hit faster than expected. A full 15 minutes early. Most likely because Lee Jinbao and his crew had blindly dug around, destroying the very last bit of structural support. The water gushing from the pipes suddenly doubled in size, and the corner of the dam started to sink rapidly. Huge cracks snaked their way up from the base. I immediately screamed at the top of my lungs, "The dam is collapsing. Everybody run, get out of here now." My warning echoed through the entire village via the live stream. The workers froze for a split second, before dropping their tools and running for their lives. Lee Jinbao foolishly tried to order the excavator to keep working, but the driver had already bailed out of the cab. He sprinted for higher ground without looking back. Lee Dakai just collapsed onto the mud, staring blankly at the dam that had cost him his entire life savings. His eyes were completely dead. I grabbed my dad and pulled him back fast. We found a safe spot on the high ground of the orchard, a good 100 meters away from the dam. I held up my phone and pointed the camera right at the crumbling structure. By now, the stream had surged past 5,000 viewers. Every single person was glued to their screen, bracing themselves for total destruction. The cracks in the middle of the dam widened violently under the pouring rain. Water blasted out of the fissures, gouging out chunks of earth. The entire dam slowly started to tilt forward. It was the final death rattle before the breach. I stared into the camera and said, deadpan, "What you are about to witness is a completely avoidable, man-made disaster." The moment the words left my mouth, a deafening explosion ripped through the air. The concrete core in the middle of the dam snapped clean in half. 80,000 cubic meters of floodwater exploded from the massive breach. It formed a terrifying wall of water, 4 meters high. The roaring surge dragged massive boulders, thick mud, and thousands of dead fish along with it. It barreled downstream, obliterating absolutely everything in its path, and my phone captured every single second of the carnage. The viewer count blasted past 10,000. The live chat was moving so incredibly fast, you couldn't even see the screen anymore. The very first second the flood broke loose, I tracked the direction of the surge. It was playing out exactly, perfectly, as I had calculated when I designed that diversion system. The raging water followed the natural slope of the land, cutting a sharp 45-degree angle down toward the southwest. And that specific direction led straight into the very heart of the Lee family's farm. The location where the luxury villa, the main restaurant building, and the auxiliary facilities stood. Meanwhile, our orchard on the east side sits on higher ground, exactly 1.2 meters higher than the Lee family's property. But more importantly, those diversion trenches I had dug all around the orchard had now formed a perfect flood barrier. Once the surface runoff reached the edge of our orchard, it was automatically guided into the deep diversion channels, and then flowed through the underground pipe network. Draining away into the low-lying areas further down, the floodwaters roared, rushing violently straight toward the Lee family's villa. That 3-story European-style building, which cost over $800,000 to build. Lee Da-cheng had planned to turn the first floor into a reception hall, and renovate the second and third floors into a bed and breakfast. But now, a 4-meter-high wall of water slammed mercilessly into the villa's load-bearing walls. The windows shattered instantly, and the doors were completely torn apart by the raging flood. The immense water pressure made the entire building let out an agonizing, overwhelmed groan. In just 30 seconds, the building's walls began to collapse. The beautifully renovated marble floors were torn up. Leather sofas and expensive mahogany furniture were tossed around in the floodwaters like cheap toys. I adjusted my phone camera, making sure every single detail was clearly recorded. The flood continued its violent rampage. The entire steel roof of the luxury restaurant was ripped right off. Kitchen equipment worth over $100,000 was washed away and smashed to pieces. The scenic wooden boardwalk fell apart like toy blocks. Those expensive treated planks were swept away by the flood, disappearing completely into the muddy, yellow torrent. The fish pond totally collapsed. The remaining 20,000 or so koi fish were scattered by the rushing floodwaters. Most of them were washed straight into the downstream drainage ditch. A few were left trapped in the shallows, struggling frantically. The $1.2 million that Lee Jin-bao had invested in those fish was now reduced to nothing but dead fish scattered everywhere. I glanced over at my dad. His expression was so complicated. He felt the sheer relief of surviving a disaster, but also deep shock at what had just happened to the Lee family. I looked into my livestream camera and said calmly, "This is the consequence of ignoring the laws of nature and building blindly." Someone in the chat started to question it, asking if I had done something shady. How could the flood so perfectly avoid my property? I was already prepared for this. I switched my phone screen, pulling up the topographic map I had prepared beforehand. The map clearly showed the elevation of the entire area. The spot where the Lee family farm is located is a natural low-lying water catchment area. Meanwhile, our orchard sits on relatively high ground. These are just objective geographical facts. Anyone can go down to the County Land Bureau and pull the raw data to verify it themselves. I continued my explanation. The Lee family chose to build a dam and store water in a low-lying area, which fundamentally violates basic water conservation common sense. I warned them about the risks multiple times. They chose to ignore me. The flood lasted for 20 minutes before it finally began to subside. The Lee family farm was completely unrecognizable. The first floor of the villa had totally collapsed, and the walls were cracked wide open. The entire building was now a condemned structure. Even though the main structure of the restaurant was still standing, the interior was completely destroyed. The fish pond had turned into a massive mud pit, leaving a terrifying, gaping hole right in the middle of the dam. Based on rough estimates, the Lee family's direct economic loss exceeded $3 million. Lee Da-kai slumped into the muddy water, his entire body trembling. Lee Jin-bao fell to his knees in front of the ruins, clutching his head in his hands, and let out a wail of absolute despair. I turned off the live stream, but I didn't delete the video. This 23-minute complete recording had already been watched by over 20,000 people and downloaded by countless viewers. It was going to become the most powerful piece of evidence in the legal proceedings to come. A heavy rain is still falling, but the worst of it is finally over. I hold my father's hand as we walk back to check on the orchard. The drainage system worked perfectly. All the floodwater has been completely drained away. There's not a single trace of waterlogging around the roots of the fruit trees. The trees we barely kept alive with foliar spray are already bouncing back, soaking up the fresh rain. You can just make out the tiny green buds sprouting on the branches. It's a clear sign they're coming back to life. I stand there in the orchard, staring out at the ruins of the Lee family estate. But the real reckoning has only just begun. Now that the floodwaters have receded, the Lee family farm looks like an empty, hollowed-out shell. Thick, yellow mud covers the entire ground. It's over 30 centimeters deep. The walls on the first floor of their villa have completely caved in. Exposed steel beams are twisted and bent completely out of shape. Their bamboo restaurant has already been condemned. They've slapped red warning tape all over it, and dead fish are blanketing the entire lower section of the property. All 50,000 of their prized koi fish have reappeared for everyone to see, just not the way they wanted. The rotting stench is carrying for hundreds of meters in the breeze. The morning after the storm stopped, 3 vehicles pull up to the Lee family farm all at once. The first is a county water authority truck. Their inspectors are gathering full evidence of the collapsed dam. The findings are crystal clear. The dam was built 1.7 meters higher than what was actually approved. And they illegally blocked off 3 emergency spillways. It's a massive, blatant violation of construction laws. The second car is a squad car from the local police station. The officers brought the entire stack of evidence I submitted earlier. That includes the reports I filed, the warning videos I took on site, and the footage of the guys Lee Jinbao sent. Destroying the floodgates in the dead of night, all caught on infrared cameras. That night footage is the nail in the coffin. It perfectly proves that the Lee family intentionally sabotaged public safety infrastructure. The third car is Boss Joe's legal team. They step out carrying massive folders of documents, getting ready to slap them with a massive civil lawsuit. I just stand there at the edge of my orchard, watching everything finally fall into place. Meanwhile, Lee Jinbao finds his father in the rubble. The two of them just stand there, staring blankly at their ruined mansion. Lee Dekai looks like he's aged 10 years overnight. His back is hunched, and his eyes are completely dead and empty. Every last drop of that arrogant swagger is just gone. At exactly 10 a.m., the police march right up to Lee Jinbao and flash an arrest warrant. The charge is endangering public safety. Blocking those spillways directly triggered the dam's collapse. And because it wiped out so many nearby roads and farmlands, it's officially a serious criminal offense. As they drag Lee Jinbao away, he turns his head to look back at the wreckage. Then he locks eyes with me in the distance. He glares at me with pure hatred, but mostly, he just looks lost. His father tries to run after him, but the officers push him back. He has no choice but to stand there. He just watches as the police cruiser vanishes down the mountain road. This man who terrorized our village for decades is finally learning what it feels like to be completely powerless. I walk further into the orchard to check on the trees. Last night's rain has deeply soaked into the earth that was dry for so long. The trees that survived off the foliar spray are finally stretching their roots out again. The groundwater levels are way up, and the soil is 2 whole shades darker than before. Later that afternoon, old Zhang finds me with an official notice. The water authority has decided to completely demolish the Lee family's illegal dam. The waterway is going to be restored to exactly how it was before they built that thing. And according to the old property records, the water rights were supposed to be shared equally between both our families all along. Since their dam was completely illegal, they forfeit all rights to it. That sentence right there is the justice I've been waiting over 20 years for. My grandfather fought until his dying breath for this without success. And now, one piece of paper has finally given it back to us just like that. But even though the law has finally settled the score, this is just the beginning. How the Lee family was going to pay off that astronomical compensation was the real final straw that broke them. On the 7th day of Lee Jinbao's criminal detention, the legal verdicts started rolling in one after another. The civil division of the county court was the first to hold a hearing for Boss Joe's lawsuit. The chain of evidence was absolutely bulletproof. The letter of investment intent signed between the Lee family and Boss Joe clearly promised that within 3 months of the farm's opening, it had to reach the agreed-upon operating status. Otherwise, they would have to refund the entire deposit and pay a penalty for breach of contract. Boss Joe's lawyer presented 37 pages of evidence in court. This included on-site photos of the Lee family's farm, the scene of the dead fish, and the video of the dam collapsing. Along with the full disaster footage I recorded during my livestream, all this evidence proved that the Lee family simply didn't have the ability to run the business properly, making it a clear case of investment fraud. The lawyer Lee Dakai hired tried to argue that the dam collapse was an act of God, a natural disaster, and the Lee family shouldn't bear all the blame. But Boss Joe's lawyer immediately pulled out the geological safety report I had originally given to Lee Dakai. Even though that report had been torn to shreds, I had kept a complete backup copy. It clearly highlighted all the hidden dangers of the dam, and what was even more damning was my phone recording showing Lee Dakai ripping up the report in public and refusing to fix the issues. This directly proved he did it on purpose. The court handed down the verdict on the spot. The Lee family was ordered to refund Boss Joe's deposit of 300,000 yuan, plus a penalty of 450,000 yuan. That's a total of 750,000 yuan. After the verdict was issued, they were given 15 days to pay up, or else face forced execution. And that was just the first payout. Right after that, the village committee filed for damages, too. Collapse of the Lee family's dam had flooded the farmlands of 12 families downstream. They lost a massive amount of crops. An investigation team led by the town government calculated that the agricultural losses totaled 230,000 yuan, and the Lee family was fully responsible. When Lee Dakai heard that number, he just slumped back into his chair. All the savings in their family accounts didn't even add up to 500,000. It was nowhere near enough to pay everyone back. Meanwhile, Lee Jinbao was still sitting in the detention center for his criminal charges. He was looking at 3 to 7 years in prison. But the bad news didn't stop there. The Water Resources Bureau issued a formal administrative penalty because the Lee family had illegally built the dam and stored water without permission. Posing a serious threat to public safety, they were hit with a fine of 120,000 yuan. At the same time, they were ordered to tear down all the illegal structures immediately and restore the land to how it was. All at their own expense. The fines and compensation claims were flying in like a blizzard. Lee Dakai went from fighting it at first, to just going numb, and finally, he gave up completely. He knew the Lee family was totally finished. On the 12th day, Lee Dakai reached out to me through a middleman. He wanted to settle things privately. He offered to sell me the ruined farm for dirt cheap, just begging me to put in a good word for him and help reduce some of the payouts. He admitted that what his family did back then was wrong, and said they honestly just didn't have the money anymore. I turned down the settlement. It wasn't because I held a grudge. It was because the legal process had to run its course. Every single debt the Lee family owed had a victim waiting for their compensation. If I stepped in to cover for them, it would be completely unfair to everyone else who got hurt. Besides, the Lee family still owed me a debt, too. I had my lawyer file the paperwork with the court, demanding they pay up for the fruit trees I lost when they cut off my water supply. I handed over 3 months of detailed records from the orchard, including soil test reports, the death toll of the trees, receipts for leaf fertilizer, and every last cent I spent trying to keep those trees alive. The total damages came out to 187,000 yuan. Lee Dakai's lawyer tried to turn the tables on me, claiming that the drainage system I dug had messed up the groundwater balance and sped up the dam's collapse. They demanded I take joint responsibility, but this was exactly the moment I'd been waiting for. I pulled out 3 crucial pieces of evidence right there in court. The first was a professional assessment report from the Provincial Geological Survey Institute, proving that my drainage system fully complied with soil and water conservation standards without a single violation. The second was a soil improvement permit from the Agricultural Bureau, proving that all the construction was legally approved. And the third was infrared security footage showing the Lee family sending people in the dead of night to sabotage my drainage trench. It clearly showed them intentionally destroying the main flood relief point. The moment those 3 pieces of evidence came out, their lawyer was left completely speechless. The judge threw out their counterclaim on the spot, and ruled that the Lee family had exactly 30 days to pay me the compensation in full. The final verdict even included a special note. The defendants were guilty of malicious infringement. When I walked out of the courtroom, I saw Lee Dakai sitting on the steps, his face buried in his hands. By the 10th day after the ruling took effect, the Lee family started selling off their assets to cover the debt. No one wanted anything to do with the ruins of their farm. It was just a wasteland full of mud and dead fish. Not a single person made an offer. even at the lowest starting bid. Lee Dekai had to scavenge through the debris of his demolished illegal buildings just to recover some rebar and bricks. He sold them for less than 20,000 yuan. After his villa was condemned as structurally unsafe, it was forcibly torn down. And the demolition costs were just another expense. That little European-style house that cost over 800,000 to build ultimately turned into a pile of construction rubble. They were even ordered to clear out the foundation entirely. To restore the land to its original state, the Lee family put their old house in the village up for sale. But thanks to Lee Jinbao's criminal case, the whole family's reputation was completely ruined. Absolutely no one dared to touch it. The asking price dropped from 600,000 all the way down to 300,000. And there were still no takers. Their last bargaining chip was that plot of land by the water source. That land was originally communal property allocated by the village, but the Lee family had leased the rights to it for 30 years. Now, desperate to raise cash to pay off his debts, Lee Dekai decided to sell off the remaining 23 years of the lease. Everyone knew exactly how valuable that plot was. Sitting right upstream, it basically controlled the lifeline of the entire area's water supply. Whoever owned that land held the power over all the downstream farmland's irrigation. Lee Dekai asked for 150,000. A few big farmers in the village came to take a look, but they all walked away when they couldn't agree on a price. Lee Dekai was desperate for cash, but he really didn't want to sell his family's property for pennies. He was completely stuck between a rock and a hard place. By the 20th day, the court's enforcement notice arrived. If the Lee family still refused to pay up, all their assets would be seized and auctioned off by the court. Lee Dekai finally caved. He reached out to me through the village chief, asking if I'd be willing to take the water source off his hands. I went out there to survey the site twice. The plot wasn't very big, only 4 mu in size, but its location was absolutely critical. All the mountain spring water from upstream pooled right there, forming a natural irrigation channel. The Lee family had relied on this exact geographical advantage back in the day to build their dam and cut off the water, essentially holding my family's orchard by the throat. I made an offer of 80,000. Lee Dekai hesitated for a long time. That price wasn't even half of what he was hoping for, but at this point, he didn't have any other choice. 3 days later, we signed the transfer agreement at the village committee. When Lee Dekai pressed his thumbprint onto the contract, his hand was trembling slightly. That plot of water source, which had carried the Lee family's ambitions for 30 years. In the end, it finally returned to the hands of the person it truly belonged to. The very same day I got the contracting rights certificate, I gathered a crew to tear down all the illegal structures. That dam the Lee family built was completely demolished. The blocked waterways were cleared out once again, and that irrigation canal that used to feed both our families finally went back to the way it used to be. The clear spring water started flowing freely again. I stood right there by the canal, watching the fresh water rush happily toward the orchard. Those irrigation trenches that had been bone dry for 3 months were finally filled to the brim once more. Deep underground, the roots of the fruit trees were greedily soaking up the moisture they had been craving for so long. The entire orchard was coming back to life. Half a month later, a miracle happened. Those fruit trees that everyone swore were as good as dead suddenly sprouted fresh buds all over. Tender green leaves were stretching out across the branches, and flower buds popped up thick and heavy. My custom foliar fertilizer and that underground diversion system I designed had actually protected the tree's core lifelines, even in that extreme environment. Now that they had plenty of water, they exploded with an unbelievable surge of growth. When the experts from the County Agriculture Bureau came down to inspect it, they were absolutely stunned. They said that making such a rapid recovery after a drought of that magnitude was nothing short of a miracle. I just smiled and kept quiet. I just took them on a tour of the underground diversion system, and showed them my scientifically balanced organic compost. Boss Joe even came looking for me. He was really interested in how I ran the orchard, and offered to invest as a partner, wanting to help me push our organic fruits into the high-end market. I agreed to it, but I made it crystal clear that I had to be the one leading the technology and management. As for Lee Jinbao, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. And after Lee Dekai sold off their old family home, he moved into a rented place in town. Every now and then, you can see him walking down the street with a hunched back. All that old arrogance of his, completely gone. I stood there in the orchard, staring at the trees loaded with fruit. In just 2 months, these fruits would be ripe and ready for the market. They had survived droughts, fierce storms, and human sabotage, yet they still managed to pull through, tough as nails. I guess that's just the sheer resilience of life. My dad stood right there beside me, with tears welling up in his eyes. He told me, if your grandpa were still here, and saw these trees come back to life, he would have been so happy. I didn't say a word. I just looked out at that irrigation canal flowing in the distance. Justice might be late sometimes, but it's never truly absent. And a real top graduate of the agricultural university doesn't just rely on a piece of paper. They use their knowledge to change their destiny.